Great. Okay. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to day 3 of week 2 of the summer school. I'm excited to introduce our speakers this morning. We'll start off with Cassidy Sujimoto from Georgia Institute of Technology, where she recently moved and is chair of the School of Public Policy. I know Cassidy from her sort of very important leadership work at the NSF, where she spent some time before her position at Indiana University. So I think many of you know Cassidy and the sort of groundbreaking work she's done looking at kind of the social science aspect of the science of science, I think, with a lot of emphasis on equity and I guess in sort of related to the work I've done with gender. So it's very exciting to have her here. Today, she'll be talking about quantifying disparities, utilizing an intersectional approach in science of science.
Thank you so much, Stephen. And as I was saying, as I got on earlier this morning, I am just so delighted to be able to be a part of this summer school. And I'm so grateful for Stephen and Daniel's work in organizing this. It looks like it's been a fantastic summer school so far. I looked at the videos from last week and I'm just very grateful that they're doing this for the community. I think it's a fantastic thing and I'm grateful to be a part. If I were there in person, I would tell you to interrupt me early and often, and hopefully we could have a lot of conversation about each of these slides. I know that's a little bit harder within the Zoom context, but I'm again grateful that Stephen and Daniel have made spots for us to have conversations both after this talk and then in different sessions. So I hope we'll have the full range of opportunities to chat about all of these issues, and feel free to critique me, interrogate me. You know, let's have a conversation about how we can do all of this better. This is a kind of research that I care deeply about and I think is really important for the future of a robust science system. So I think all of you in this room are the future of that. So I hope that you improve upon all of this, and I hope that it is interesting and useful to you. So as Stephen said, I'm going to talk a little bit about quantifying disparities. And slightly different than I would do most talks, I'm going to focus a little bit more on the methodological aspects of this. As this is a summer school, I want us to think through how we measure these things. And again, as I said before, I want you to critique this and think through this. Is this actually the best way to do this? Are there better ways that we can look into the socio-demographic characteristics of scientists in order to understand science? What can we do with these tools and how can we make these tools better? So I'll spend a little bit more time on that than I would otherwise, but also show you some of the results that we've found in order to illuminate what's possible once you apply these tools to the large scientific data sets that we have. So I'll start just a little bit with an overview of our previous work on gender. And it was striking to me as I was preparing this talk that it has been nearly a decade since we started work on our gender disambiguation algorithm. Vincent Lariviere and I were sitting in the back of a hotel conference room chatting, and we were like, I wonder if we could infer the gender of the names of all these authors, what would that look like? And we started playing around with it, did a lot of manual validation and actually finding the authors, seeing how well this algorithm worked. We did several rounds of refinement, and even over the last decade, we've continued to refine that every year to try to make improvements upon the gender disambiguation algorithm. And then we've applied it to a lot of different data sets to answer a lot of different research questions. So we've looked at this over the world, finding that predominantly authorships are male, and a few countries where we have larger female authorships than male authorships are countries that have seen a lot of resource drain, where men have predominantly left the country for better opportunities in other countries, and there are not high degrees of investment in science, demonstrating a bit of a parity paradox. Sometimes when we're seeking parity and we look at it, we find that parity is often at the expense of equity. Where we find equal representation of women in science, whether it's by field or by country, is places that are under-resourced or don't have the capacity to produce science as other places. So that becomes a very interesting conversation when we think about quotas and different representation. We've used the gender disambiguation algorithm to look across disciplines, demonstrating and reinforcing what we've known from sociology of science, that women tend to be highly represented in care disciplines, nursing, social work, education, library science, hearing and speech sciences, and underrepresented across all the other realms of knowledge. We've also used the growing amounts of contributorship data to look not only how women appear on the bylines, but why they appear on the bylines, the kind of work that they do to warrant authorship, showing that women are disproportionately likely to be associated with methodology, visualization, analysis, writing the entire work, data curation and investigation, where men's authorship tends to come from supervision, funding acquisition, resources conceptualization, showing this bifurcation of scientific labor and reward, where women are really the hands of science, and men often tend to be those who are gathering resources for the scientific work itself. We've looked at this in the context of peer review to understand how women's work is evaluated in the process, in that gatekeeping process of science, finding that women are much less likely, controlling for all other things, their number of collaborators, their discipline, the institution from which they're coming, that their work is rejected at higher rates of their male counterparts. So each of these things gives us some insight on the role of women in science. And we've been really pleased to see that this has been adopted by the community. So the National Science Board, which puts out the science and engineering indicators every year, run through the NCSES at the NSF, started incorporating these gender disambiguation algorithms into their work. So as they're giving a state of science for the country, they're actually thinking about gender as a variable. Many different companies have sprouted up in the last decade to be able to provide gender disambiguation algorithms like GenderEyes.io, many of which are making their data freely available so that people can incorporate these into their work. And publishers are adopting this in mass. So Elsevier is producing reports. It's had, I think, 2 or 3 now large-scale gender reports. The American Chemical Society is also running reports on gender, as well as the Royal Society of Chemistry and others. So this to me is really an exciting thing, knowing that if you create one of these tools, you demonstrate its applicability, it becomes adopted in the community and normalized in a way that it can be used for policymaking. And for me, I think the strongest way that we have utilized this into policymaking is this one piece. And this piece is really important to me because it differentiates sort of diversity in science from an equity and justice point of view to demonstrating the consequences of that diversity in science. So what we did here is took data from PubMed. And for this first slide, we're not looking at who's producing the science, but rather how sex is incorporated into scientific studies. Now, if you look at biomedical studies, for the large part, sex is not incorporated as an analytic variable. And there are a few studies, and increasingly studies, that are incorporating sex and using both male and female samples within it. And then we see a low level of female and male only. Clinical medicine and health has seen a large uptake in actually the incorporation of both sexes and sex as an analytic variable in the studies. Now you may say, well, why should biomedical science do that? They're mostly doing things at the cellular level. But we know that there are huge differences in the sex of cells, the absorption of lipids, the responses to stress. And part of this is the reason that we see that the majority of drugs withdrawn from the market are withdrawn because they have adverse effects from women. When you test different pharmaceuticals and don't take sex into account, they're going to have adverse effects for the populations that may not be within the dominant populations or the studied populations. So the NIH and other institutes have largely advocated that sex be included as a variable in biomedical research, and that you take both sexes into account. Now, what we did is we took that gender disambiguation algorithm and we overlaid that. So who is taking sex into account and in what fields? So going back just to look at sort of the validity of the algorithm, we find that in obstetrics and gynecology, you're mostly studying females. That makes sense. Urology, you're mostly studying males. That makes sense. But when we look at physiology, we tend to be studying men. When we look at pharmacology, we tend to be studying men. So there are these huge disparities in fields that we should have neutrality around gender, where we're overemphasizing certain genders. And if we look at the gender of the author, we find that women are significantly more likely to take sex into account as an analytic variable and significantly more likely to study women. And this is exacerbated when we have women in both first and last authors, demonstrating that when women are doing science, we know more about women. And that is a really important finding, given that women make up 50% of the population. So going back to that initial question, when we talk about diversity in science, it's not only to say it's good for the scientists, right? All people should have access to all kinds of occupational careers, but rather to say that the introduction of women into science changes what we know, and particularly what we know in health and medicine, which has implications and ramifications for all of society. Now, in this case, we were just looking at gender. And so one of the spaces we wanted to do was expand that to look at other sociodemographic characteristics and how that changes actually the foundation of what we know. So from our work in gender, a few different sort of high-level observations. There are systematic and institutionalized barriers for women's success in science. But quantification is a tool that can be used to demonstrate the extent of these disparities and to create that empirical basis for policy change. It's very difficult to make policy change on anecdote, and policy change needs to be driven by this evidence base. And in that way, this quantification can be very useful, despite all of the limitations of quantification, which I'd be the first to tell you. And in this way, we're following what D'Ignazio and Klein have read. If you haven't read Data Feminism, I strongly encourage it. And they talk about counting and measuring not always having to be tools of oppression, but they can be used to hold power accountable, to reclaim overlooked histories, and to build collectivity and solidarity. Now, if we look at different kinds of quantification as tools of oppression, one of the strongest examples of that has to be the census. The US Census has gone through several changes over its time period. And if we look in the 1790 census, we see these categories: free white males, 16 and up, free white males, 16 and over. So white males get 2 categories. Then all free white females get a category. Then all other persons get a category. And then slaves, who are not considered as persons. And so we can see in this example that when we create categories around sociodemographic characteristics, we reinforce and we reify many of the oppression and systematic institutionalized oppression systems that we have within a country. So we have to be really careful about that. At the same time, we agree with Zuberi and Best, who said that this racialization of data can be used both to preserve that stratification, right? Things like the census are preservations of these tools of oppression, but it can also be used to destroy this. So in our work, we've talked about placing race as a statistical category as one that can both reinforce these social processes that segregate and disempower, but it can also provide that empirical basis for understanding and mitigating inequities. And I think one of the best examples of that, I think just to bring it to the fore for those who may not be thinking about race and gender studies, is The Red Record by Ida B. Wells. So I assume that many of you are familiar with it, but given the international audience, you may not. So Ida B. Wells was a journalist that lived in Chicago. And what she started doing was a simple tabulation of lynching within the United States. So the hanging of predominantly Black people within the US and the alleged causes of those lynchings. And what she was able to do with that data is make manifest something that was happening visibly and publicly, but by tabulating the data, the entire country became aware of it and was able to take action on it. So it moved it from these anecdotes, from things people had heard about but didn't really understand, and it made it really strong in being able to see just the extent of it across the United States. So I think that these kinds of ways are ways we understand that anytime you start to categorize in these sociodemographic characteristics, in some ways you are utilizing things that have been created for often negative purposes, but in their quantification and their manifestation, you can actually enact change. And that's what we're trying to do. So we've taken our work in gender disambiguation, and we're trying to do that for racial and ethnic disambiguation that we could use across large scale data. So we focused on the US, and I think it's very critically important when we're doing this work to contextualize it within a given country and context, which has its own historical and political space that you have to take into account. So we used 2 data sets, the US Census, which is also what we used as the basis of our gender disambiguation algorithm. And we have surnames that appear at least 100 times, which gives us about 160,000 surnames that cover 90% of the population. And then we also have a set of US mortgage data, and that provides us given names, much fewer given names, but also self-reported race as we have with the US Census. And the categories that are derived from that are these: white, non-Hispanic, Black, non-Hispanic, Asian, non-Hispanic, American Indian and Alaska Native, 2 or more, and Hispanic. Now already you can see how problematic some of these categories can be, the conflation of race and ethnicity, the way in which they are categorized. So we acknowledge and sort of understand those problematic categories. But I think, as you'll see, it can still be used as a way for us to illuminate certain disparities within the US scientific population. So what we did is we applied this to the corpus of Web of Science. So using 2008 to 2019, from when we have first names available, there are about 21, that should say million, not thousand articles, with 1.6 million first names, 150,000 distinct given names, nearly 300,000 distinct family names. Now, given that the American Indian and 2 or more races account for less than 1% and less than 2% of authors respectively, we removed them. And I do want to just take a quick kind of footnote here as a summer school that I think we should be very, very cautious about that. In many of our studies, we kind of say, oh, well, we're just going to remove these because they don't reach statistical significance. When we're looking at gender as a binary, we often say, oh, we're going to remove the non-binary population because they don't reach statistical significance. I think we have to be very careful in what we're doing there. We're effectively saying that if you're not statistically significant, you don't have value. You're not significant. We don't care what your results look like. And I think as a community, we need to move away from that. Yes, we do large scale studies. Yes, we use statistics, which have its own set of caveats, but we need to find places, even if in the supplemental data, to describe and use descriptive statistics to understand what some of these smaller populations look like and begin to gather data on them, lest they be sort of removed and therefore made invisible throughout all of our studies. So that said, what we're going to focus on are these 4 kind of general categories: Asian, Black, Hispanic, and white. Now, to give you a sense of how this data looks, for our given names and our family names, we would have something like this. We would have Juan as a given name. Now, 93% of the instances of Juan are going to be associated with someone who's self-reporting as Hispanic. 1.5% would be Asian, 4.5% white. Doris, you can see, is mostly associated with people self-reporting as white and as Black. Andy as white and as Asian, and the family names, you see that distribution across there. So in all of these cases, it's not a space where we can say that name is Hispanic or that name is white, but rather we have sort of a fractionalized understanding of how it's distributed across the population. So what we're doing through most of these studies, and we'll get to that closer, is not identifying a single author on a single paper with a given race or ethnicity, but rather understanding a fractionalized representation of that race or ethnicity across the population of documents. And that becomes really important when you think about the kinds of questions that you can ask from these data. So what we started with was a manual validation in the same way we had done with our gender. So we took counts of these names that were 90 to 100% associated with Asian names, at 80 to 89%, at 70 to 79%. And we went out and tried to find these individual scholars, and using different kinds of representative words in their bios, in their CVs, using photos, to try to understand whether the algorithm was accurately classifying people who were at that certain threshold. And what we found is that names that were associated with a certain race or ethnicity at above 90% were strongly associated with those names. That was a pretty good indicator. Once we moved to the 80 percentile, we found that Black names started to have a lot more invalid responses, things that were classified as that were not necessarily Black authors. And when we went to the 70 to 879 percentile, Black and Hispanic authors tended to have a lot of errors within that data. So it wasn't accurately reflecting those populations. So we also took many statistical ways to try to validate that. So we thought, okay, the best is to use both sets of information, to use both our last names and our first names. And we tried to weight those given the informativeness of those names. As you can see through these various things, the given names were not as informative. Last names tended to be much more informative than first names in being indicative of a certain race or ethnicity. And that's perhaps a little bit easier to see here when we look at it by the threshold. So if you look at the family names, if you take the number of family names that we have that's associated with, for example, scholars of color. So if we look at our Black scholars, there are very, very, very few names that are associated above 50%. So the sort of informativeness, the uniqueness of those names is very low. If we look at the Asian names, we see a huge spike at 90%. That means there's a lot of Asian names that are very, very informative as family names. Almost 100% of those family names are going to be there. Our given names are much lower overall. Again, we see a spike for our Asian names, that there is a set of Asian first names that's highly informative, and the rest are relatively not. Another way to look at this is to take different normalizations, to look at this skewness, to understand that underrepresentation of Black authors. But any way we ran this, and we ran this in 8 different ways, we found that our Black authors were wildly underrepresented within this because of the lack of sort of the informativeness of the name. That is, that there are very few names that are uniquely associated with Black authors, either at the first name or the last name. We also thought that maybe we can do some imputation to try to understand how this should look within the space. But if we look at that, we have to decide what our representative values should be. So if you just look at the US Census versus the Web of Science population, you see that white authors are slightly underrepresented compared to their population. Hispanic authors grossly underrepresented, but our Asian authors are wildly overrepresented in Web of Science. So when you're doing imputation, using the proportions that we see in the census is not necessarily representative of the scientific population. So you really have to think about what is that population that's representative or that you would expect to see within each of these spaces. And so after sort of this validation things, we come with a lot of do's and don'ts here, and I won't read through all of these, but really it's a focus on family names rather than given names. And that thresholding doesn't really work. And that's what we've used throughout gender studies. We've said, okay, if the name's 80% or above or 90% above associated with a woman or a man, we're going to code that individual as a woman or a man. When you do that with race data, you effectively lose your entire Black population, and at a certain threshold, your Hispanic population. And so that approach really doesn't work when we're moving to this. So we have to use rather these sort of aggregated distributions instead, and be very careful about how we do imputation, given that the scientific population does not look like the general population. So to sort of summarize on that, thresholds for race and ethnicity results in systemic underrepresentation for Black Hispanic authors, particularly depending on the threshold. And there is a high similarity between white and Black surnames, given the history of slavery within the US. This is not unexpected, but it introduces a type 1 error for Black authors and often overestimates the proportion of white authors. So in some of the data I'm going to show you, you may say, I'm actually surprised of some of the citation values for Black authors, but we have to understand that between our white and Black male authors, we tend to have a few different types of errors that are entering into that. So that has to be understood within the context of the results. So I definitely want to get time to show a few of the results and what you can do. So, you know, as a summer school, I wanted to spend more time on the kind of methodological thing and have you think about that. But now I want to show you what you can know once you do this. So we'll start just with the representation. Using the race and ethnic disambiguation algorithm, we can look at the representation across these main fields, and it reinforces many of the things that we already know. If we look at women, particularly Latinx, Black, and white women, they are underrepresented in engineering, mathematics, and physics, overrepresented in health psychology and the arts. What's interesting here is that we see sort of a difference between the females or women, I should say, and men, except for in the case of Asian men and women, where Asian women seem to be find representation that's more closely aligned with Asian men than it is with the population of Latinx, Black, and white women. So we see these different spaces, Asian men being overrepresented in engineering, tech, mathematics, and physics, and an underrepresentation of white, Black, and Latinx men in the health sciences, and health as differentiated from the biomedical sciences. Now, if you look at the top, you see the citation rate for each of these populations. And we see that all men and Asian women are cited at higher degrees than Latinx, Black, and white women. Now, we've also taken the normalized citation, accounting for the different citation rates in these fields. And what we find is it does increase it slightly, but not to the level of men. So even in fields where they are under or overrepresented, even accounting for field difference, Latinx, Black, and white women are still cited at lower degrees than their counterparts. Now, I think this becomes striking when we go and break out from those big categories to every fine-grained topic. So taking a few hundred topics and then placing those across a spectrum where you look from the least cited to the most cited, and then overlaying the representation of race and gender on top of that, we see this clear scaffolding with men on top being the most cited and women on the bottom, and Asian men and white men and Asian women and white women being at the top of those distributions, which shows that there is this clear systematic scaffolding in the receipt of citations by the intersection of race and gender across all of these spaces. So this suggests that these differences in research impact that we see are partly mediated by and explained by the participation in certain topics and the citation density for those topics. But it is actually compounded by this participation, that even when we control for those participations, we see that there is less visibility and less attention paid to the places where women and particularly minoritized women are performing. Now, there's also a role here for teams, and I find this just absolutely fascinating in terms of homophily across teams. And I know you've seen some presentations this week that speak to some of these issues. So I think it's fun to see this from lots of different lenses. So if we look at our last authors and first authors, we see that our white, Hispanic, and Black men tend to congregate in certain teams, and that our white, Hispanic, and Black women also tend to be in teams. So there is this gender homophily in teams, but that's broken by our Asian authors. So Asian men and women are much more likely to collaborate together than they are to collaborate along gendered lines. So we see different functions of race and gender for different populations coming in. So we can't just assume that an Asian woman is going to operate like other kinds of women. It's not the case in terms of the construction of teams. Now, part of this can be explained both by nationality, which we don't account for here, right? Many of the Asians in the population are actually Asians who are studying and coming from abroad rather than Asians who were born within the US. And we don't distinguish between those two in this category, which is problematic for the analysis itself. And we also see that we find the same kinds of relationship when we look at citations. So who is citing whom? And white men, Black men, and Latinx men are disproportionately likely to cite other men, women to cite other women, but we also see that Asian men and women are likely to cite each other. And this is controlling for self-citation, so we remove that out of it. But we see that, for example, Latinx men and women are wildly overrepresented in their self-citations. So this shows that across the board, right, we see homophily in this kinds of citation patterns. But then you have to think about the representation of those populations. When we know that Latinx men and women are underrepresented in science, this homophily does not benefit them to the same extent that homophily among white men will benefit them. There's simply more of them, and the citation advantage is going to be much stronger. All of this, of course, is compounded by career age. So if we look across our data set, men are much older, which places them in senior positions than our Black men and our Latinx men. Asian men and women tend to be younger in the data set. And again, this is the influx of foreign-born students coming in and then leaving the US scientific workforce, which was the parameters of our study. So we're seeing the influx of a lot more early career researchers among the Asian population. Our white women are the oldest within the women, but we see these different spaces there. So again, compounding by issues of seniority. To sort of summarize that, we see homophily in team composition and citation along these race and gender lines, and that it is compounded by issues of seniority, which creates these systemic barriers for success in minoritized populations. When we're thinking about homophily in team composition, homophily in citation, and organization on topics that's going to reduce their citation receipt. So the last slide I'll show on this, which I find absolutely fascinating. So in line with the work that we did looking at gender and the representation of women in there, is we tried to look across all the topics and where certain populations were over or underrepresented. So I know there's a lot going on in this slide, so I'll break it down for a second. We have the social sciences on the left and health on the right, just as two exemplars. And then we have for the y-axis feminization, so the proportion of women in that topic, and on the x-axis, the proportion of that certain population, Asian, Black, Latinx, or white. And what we find is that if we look at, for example, topics that are strongly associated for Black women, we have violence, gender-based violence, we have families, we have learning. If we look at topics associated With Black men, we have religion and Africa and African American communities, showing this homophily in topic, that as people come into a topic space, they're bringing their own lived experience. They're investigating topics that are relevant to their communities and to their personal experience. If we look in the Latinx, we see immigrant, racial discrimination, language, families, Argentina, right, coming in the space. For white, we see families, learning, literacy, LGBT. If we go over to the health side, we see similar things. Are Black scholars concerned about African Americans and their health? Are Latinx concerned with English femmes, the Latinx body itself, and our Asian population with China? So again, this strong reinforcement. Now, one thing I will show on the side of the social sciences and our Asian population is a strong organization around things that are non-identifying, like stocks, firms, consumer, market, which shows sort of that lack of integration of a racialized identity into topic selection. Again, I would question how much of that comes with those issues in seniority, as we saw that the Asian population was a more early career researcher focused, which may be sort of a population coming in and studying what their PI is designating rather than having autonomy over their research area. So there's issues of seniority that certainly play into this. But I think this is, again, a very important reinforcement that when we have diversity in the scientific population, we will know different things. It opens up new spaces of knowledge, and it brings to light certain issues that majority populations may not have given the same types of attention to. So a strong homophily between this research topic and research demographics. And just sort of as a fun thought process, what we did is we took that US Census and we said, what if the scientific population looked like the US Census? Well, we'd have about 30% more articles on public health, 20% more on gender-based violence, 18% more on tropical diseases, and 17% more research on families, right? So it really shifts the emphasis of scientific production when we change who is in science. So I know I'm coming up on time. I'll just go very quickly through this next space, is to say, so how do we do this? How do we actually change what the scientific workforce looks like? And this is in part to show you some results, but also to encourage you to integrate with other sources of data. So this study used the survey of earned doctorates and the survey of doctoral recipients, which are these large census of individuals receiving doctorates from US institutions, and then a cross-sectional survey that they have conducted since 1973 in the US, which gives huge amounts of sociodemographic data for our doctorates. And we match that with the Web of Science to yield some interesting insights. So again, I'll go through these very quickly because I know we're pretty close on time. But different compositions, as we saw before from our Web of Science data, in what men and women are studying and how they're over or underrepresented within certain degree areas. And then we looked at very simple binary distinction. Did they have a publication before their PhD or after their PhD? And what did that do in terms of their trajectory? Now, when you have a publication before, you're much more likely to go into R&D. When you have one right after your PhD, you're much more likely to go into academic R&D. So we see a clear path dependency on production of scientific articles early in your career in order for you to stay within the scientific publishing community. But if we look at who's producing publications pre and post-doctorate, we see strong differences by the intersection of race and ethnicity, with our Black male and female scholars, and to some extent Hispanic male and female scholars, much less likely to produce a paper before their PhD, even when we control for disciplinary differences. So we looked at this across all of those. Are they more likely? Now, there are some field differences, but we see systematic differences in their proclivity to publish before the doctorate, and those pretty much go away after they finish their PhD. Those who keep publishing after their PhD, we don't see as much difference there. So it's really something that's happening during doctoral education. So we looked to see what was the biggest predictor of publishing during your doctoral education. And if we control for everything, right? Whether you are a first generation student, whether you have children or not, what discipline you're in, what type of institution you're in, what we find is that our Black, Hispanic, and female scholars are significantly less likely to receive a research assistantship than white and Asian counterparts. And the receipt of that research assistantship creates huge path dependencies towards publishing. So if you have a research assistantship, you're much more likely to publish. So at that moment of acceptance to a doctoral program, when we give certain people a research assistantship and other people teaching assistantships, or even fellowships, which were shown to actually be very low in terms of their production of articles, what we do is we are already creating a path towards the professoriate for some and not for others. So this is a really simple policy intervention in terms of providing research assistantships, particularly for minoritized populations, that will lead to greater propensity to publish during their PhD studies and therefore to continue on into scientific publishing. So these create these path dependencies for scientific careers, and we are systematically underrepresenting minoritized populations in those research experiences. So my last slide, just sort of bring up an engineering quote, and I know some of you have heard me say this, but I think it's very evocative, right? So we find that women are 47% more likely to sustain a serious injury in a car crash and 17% more likely to have a fatal consequence. Why? Well, because they're often non-compliant. It wasn't until the last few decades that we actually introduced a female-typed crash dummy into the car. And that woman was cast as a 5'1", 100-pound version of a male dummy. Now, I don't know how many women you know who are 5'1", 100 pounds and basically have the body type of a man, but that's how they were made. And then they were only placed in the passenger seat. So if you're a woman who's outside of those measurements, if you're driving a car, God forbid if you're pregnant, in any of those ways, you're non-compliant. And we find that women pull the seat up closer. They tend to be closer to the steering wheel, closer to the dashboard. And so the car is not fit for them, right? It wasn't designed for a woman to be driving. It wasn't designed around her body type. And in the same way, we haven't designed science for many populations. We've designed science to fit predominantly for a man who has means and resources, who has a wife who is doing most of the elder care or child care that's happening at home, that's cooking meals, that allows them to travel and to go to conferences. We've created an ideal worker type that really only works for a very small slice of the population. And so I think it's really important that as we're creating science policies, we think about this. How do we ensure that science fits everyone rather than trying to make everyone fit into science? So with that, I will end thanking all of my collaborators and looking forward to talking to all of you.
Great. Thank you, Cassidy. It's you can see the virtual applause floating around. I think there's a fascinating presentation. And if you weren't following the chat, lots of conversation in the chat. Yeah, so why don't we get started with questions, Dominika?
Hi, thank you for this great and inspirational talk. I have two questions, one more technical. Can you extrapolate your algorithms to not US context, namely when can we take them and use them in European context or any other to distinguish race and gender? And the second one is, could you speculate a bit about inequalities regarding North-South division and how they play in the scientific, in science? Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Two fantastic questions. So that is the area that we're working on next, is trying to find other context in which we can apply this. So the places that we're looking right now are in South Africa and in the UK and in Brazil. And what we're trying to do is identify places that both collect data and collect data around race and ethnic categories. So many countries do not collect it at all because they are concerned with the reification of these sort of classifications on society. So we need to find countries that both create their own census around this, and we want to find places where there has been heightened racial tensions to be able to understand that effect. So we're in the process of trying to gather that data, and then again we can do essentially the same process. We limit the Web of Science to only those that have affiliations within that country, and then we overlay their own racial categories on top of it. I'm very concerned with any study that takes this too broadly across different countries, because I think you really have to contextualize it within their own classification of race within and ethnicity within the country. So I'm really interested in seeing how well it applies across different countries and what we can know from that. Yes, the North-South divide inequalities are are huge here. I am not sure how well the race and ethnic disambiguation algorithm answers that compared to using affiliation data instead. So one of the things that we've done before is trying to look at the first affiliation in which someone published to understand sort of their mobility using Web of Science data. And I think that gives us a better sense there. If we use affiliation data as a marker of sort of origin, it's not always accurate. It tends to be particularly poor in terms of the Asian names, but that's another way that we can look at how people are getting credit based on their origin. Of course, I would love to have better sets that actually show national origin, but that becomes a little bit more difficult. We can talk about ORCID and other places, but comprehensive data sets that do that are lacking.
Okay, I guess, Daniel, you're allowed to ask a question.
I'm muted. Sorry that I'm taking space of others, but I was wondering, I guess Hispanic is a very broad term, so it's very US centric in my view. That you have, I mean, myself, I have all kinds of backgrounds. So I wonder if, and this is more of a comment, maybe in the future, or maybe someone has done it, there is just so much differences within the Hispanic community. You have, Puerto Ricans not doing that great in New York City, but then you have, Argentinians and Mexico, of course, is very diverse. You have here in the US, people probably think of migrants that come, immigrants that come undocumented, but there is a huge diversity in Mexico. The same thing happens with China. So China is extremely diverse. You have South China, the interior parts of China, and Asia. You have Southeast Asia is very different from Chinese, Koreans, and Japanese. So I'm wondering if anybody has done like more detailed analysis. The same can be said about Europe, Western Europe and Eastern Europe. And there's like maybe more details within those communities.
Yes, absolutely. And it's a fantastic question. And again, there's always a sense of caution that I have in doing these because they are aggregating such heterogeneous populations. So as you said, for the Hispanic population, that's a very broad category with wildly different lived experiences. But we can look at the Black category as well, the experience of African Americans and the experience of scholars from Africa who are first generation is wildly different. Even the white category, which people think is the least problematic, with the US Census, it includes those from the Middle East. And if you've been following any sort of tensions within the US for the last decade, collapsing those into a single category and not taking into account their own lived experience is going to be highly problematic. So in each of these categories, we have huge issues, particularly with a country that for its scientific workforce has been historically dependent upon foreign-born scholars. And so there is a huge mix between first generation and second, et cetera, secondary generations in terms of their experiences. And then within that, all of the different cultural dimensions within the Asian category, for example, huge cultural dimensions that are happening there. So I take all of that into account. And this is where I have to say, I think that the most important thing is that we triangulate between macro, meso, and micro level approaches here, is that we can kind of get this large macro level understanding of what's happening, and then we need to zoom in. We need to break apart some of these categories and understand the differences that are happening within there. So I think that that's absolutely essential. There are some other disambiguation algorithms that look at more of the origin. So you may have seen some of these classification systems, which says, okay, is it Celtic? Is it Germanic? Is it right? And so it plays with those. It actually incorporates both religion and ethnicity into that as well. So Judaic names come up as a different category within that. So there are a few of those that exist right now, which can give you a different flavor, particularly if you're trying to understand Europe as a unit. Those disambiguation categories work fairly well. So I think people are still exploring the space and trying to find better classification schemes that take into account these nuanced nature of all these different populations within an aggregate category.
Thank you. Sorry, but Sylvia couldn't raise her hand before, and I'm pretty sure she was before the two people raising their hand. So
I'm sorry, I have a background, a funny background I had yesterday. I need to remove it. But yeah. So my question has to do, and thank you so much. I think this is a very problematic issue, and I'm sure you always get a lot of questions because it is problematic. And I'm very much concerned with the fact that of what this wonderful word you already mentioned, that it's reification. So like I'm very concerned with the fact that in a US centric kind of view of the world, the one drop rule rules, right? And not always, if your last name is Gutierrez, you would identify yourself as Latina, right? Or my father's last name is Chinese, but I don't think he will feel you know, like, oh, I am Asian, right? So I think this is very interesting. And in fact, the visualization you showed with the interest or the subjects of different ethnicities, there was the Asian that talked a lot about Mexican and Latino bodies. And so I was wondering, could that be that they're actually, you know, Mexican with Chinese last names that that were taking part of that so yeah, I think you already kind of answered that you want to do like meso and micro level thing, but I don't know. And also, why talk about gender, you know, and not about sex identified by the names? Can you actually infer gender by the name rather than, you know, given sex? So it's just, yeah, I think, why are we talking about ethnicities and relate that with last names? Or why are we talking about gender and relate that with names and not other ways of addressing the subject? Thank you. And thank you so much for this talk. We're all like thinking like,
no, it's so important. All the questions you asked are so important. And there are things that I, you know, wrestle with through all of this. I find that I'll sort of start with one defense of the method and then go and interrogate it. I find that those topic distributions that we see and what we've seen in our gender disambiguation algorithm are two things. One, that when we manually validate it, it tends to reflect their self-reported ethnicities and genders as well. So I do think that there is a degree of accuracy. And I think that the topic displays actually reinforce the validity of it, demonstrating that there is an alignment between this algorithmically defined race or ethnicity and the kinds of topics that they're studying. I do not think that it is 100% accurate in each individual, but I think at the very high macro level, it's giving a sense of this homophily. Now, of course, this is extremely problematic at the individual level, and I would never take this down to the individual. I mean, I think my name is a fantastic example. I have a Japanese last name and a male first name. So the algorithm would misclassify me on both counts, right? This is not something that we should take down and look for each individual person. This is really only to be utilized at that very large scale macro level to see, are there changes, are there shifts that are happening, are there different populations in the aggregate that are being systemically overlooked? And if we go and say, all right, on the basis of this, we could go to the National Institutes of Health and say, are you funding things on gender-based violence? Are you funding things on these issues and these topics that the minoritized populations are disproportionately studying? What we find is that they're not. And so we can make large policy recommendations at the high level in order to improve the areas of research that are being studied by certain populations in the aggregate, not individually. That said, I completely agree with you that it can be problematic. And my goal would be to get to a point where we don't need any of these, right? That would be the dream point, is not to have to do these analyses anymore. But these analyses keep reinforcing that there are systematic differences along these lines seen in this very crude way. And I definitely don't defend it as being perfectly accurate, but I do think that it's giving us a glimpse and an insight into some of these ways that we're seeing it. And yes, it is US centric, and I would emphasize that it's intentionally US centric. I would not extrapolate this to populations outside of the US that are operating outside of those contexts. But the US context also has that implied discrimination. So whether you identify as a man or woman, whether you identify as Latinx or not, on the basis of your last name, people are going to be making decisions about you. The implicit bias that comes in when someone sees your name has been reinforced by psychological studies over and over and over again. So in some ways, it's less about your perception of your identity, but other people's perceptions of your identity that lead to this systematic bias and these sort of systems of oppression. So again, I would love to break out of that, but I think that it's a reality of the perspective that's being placed upon you as a scholar.
And all right, so we're gonna, remember, we do have the panel later today, so we can ask questions. And I think lots, anyways, there's a lot going on in the chat still too. Maybe we can just have one more quick question from Luis, and then we'll have to move on, I think, to get Vincent started.
Hi, Cassie. Thanks for such a nice talk. My question was also a bit reflected by Daniel's and Sylvia's questions. And I was thinking about if it makes more sense to think of race as a continuous spectrum and use it like that instead of a categorical variable, because I mean, it's quite complicated to define yourself as one single race, right? Because, for example, I'm from Spain, but my father is from Chile, so I'm Hispanic and I'm Latino, but then my phenotype is like I need a factor 50 sunscreen to tell me to walk in the street because I'm quite white. So I think it will be more reflected like using race as a spectrum, but I don't know if there is any work in that sense and how easy it will be to implement this this continuous variable instead of using just one single classification. I don't know.
Yeah, absolutely. And if we had more time, I mean, the history of the introduction of 2 or more races into the census is fascinating. And of course, personally, as the mother of 2 children who would select that category, it's something I think about a lot. But I'll go back to just the methodological part of this disambiguation algorithm. As I said before, when we did the gender disambiguation, we identified someone as male or female and then unknown, and we threw them out. So it was the classification of someone into a single category. We were not able to do that with race and ethnicity. This is a distribution across that space. So having a name like Sugimoto would be X% Asian, right? So we are actually distributing it, which again goes down into not the individual. We're using the continuum actually, but in the aggregate across the whole population, rather than identifying the author on that paper as being Hispanic and that one as being Black, but rather that person's X% Hispanic, X% Black in it. And so the data that you see in all those visualizations is actually based on that distributional effect rather than categorical. And I think that that's a really important distinction in this, because I agree with you that it is not, I think the categorical approach creates huge disparities and bias in the data, as we saw, particularly with the Black scholars.
Okay, great. Well, thanks again, Cassidy. And maybe by the end of the day we'll have solved this problem.
Yeah, that'd be great.